Last week, we didn't have a map. I was very disappointed personally, but there was no map last week. Don't worry, we've got a map this week. Hooray for maps. And, we're following Paul's journey, and he's on his way to Rome. He's been arrested for being a Christian, essentially, and arrested in Jerusalem, and he travels up to Caesarea, which is on the coast. And from there he's committed to the care of this centurion and taken as a prisoner to Rome, where he will stand before Caesar. The journey begins in a fairly routine way. The ship goes along, but as they sail past, sailing past Crete, they encounter this horrendous storm. And we looked at that last week. They were, for 14 days, they are driven along by this terrible, terrible storm. They let down a sea anchor, which is like a sail into the sea, isn't it? And Bill will know all about this. And just to give stability, and on ropes behind the ship, which is sort of stopping the ship bobbing about quite so much, so that this weight which is in the water is sort of giving this little bit of stability. But it's not working because the ship begins to break up. They worry the ship will break up, so they tie it all and bind the ship, they go to the car and go over, they throw the ship's tackle over, they throw just about everything over in the hope that they will be saved. And eventually Paul speaks to the captain and says, God has spoken to me and told me that nobody is going to be harmed. And we're going to come adrift ashore on some island and nobody is going to be harmed. And just as Paul prophesies, this is exactly what happens after being in this storm, this terrible storm. And they're not able to see the stars at night or the sun during the day, so they don't know where they are. They just know that they're in the sea and they're being driven along by this terrible, terrible wind and terrible storm. And they end up on this island. They don't even know which island it is at first when they land on it. And we've got a description in the previous chapter how when they crash ashore, they're just offshore, and those who can swim ashore, and then those who can't swim cling to bits of wood as the ship has broken up and float in. And so this is where they are. They're driven ashore onto the island of Malta. Some years ago, Jackie and myself got married. And we went on honeymoon to Malta and actually stayed in a place called St. Paul's Bay. I don't know if it is the bay where St. Paul landed, but that's what it's called anyway. And it was really interesting to see this island. It's fascinating. There are lots of fascinating things on this, really, in the whole passage. The first thing I want to say is they're washed up, aren't they? And they've been brought through, to say the least, a trauma. What? That's an understatement, isn't it? I was listening to the traffic news on, I think it was Friday night, and they were talking about a traffic jam on the M25, 55 miles long. 55 miles long. I think if that was me, I'd go around the other way, wouldn't you? But they're 55 miles long on that's traumatic. But that's nothing compared to this, is it? Where they are on this ship, and it's obviously a fairly sizable ship. I mean, there's 276 people or whatever it is on board this ship. And it's just being smashed. They don't know where they are. They don't know what reefs are aboard. It talks about them taking soundings to see, and it's getting shallower. They sense they're getting closer to land. But they don't know what land. They don't know where there's a terrible reef. They're going to be smashed to bits. They don't know. All they have is Paul's promise. That God has spoken to him and told them that they will be safe. And so when they eventually do come ashore, they've been through what has been a traumatic experience. And they must have been exhausted. Exhausted. The sheer strain of trying to keep all this together. The physical exhaustion of being, moved around and bouncing around on in this ship. Julie's got a place, isn't she, around the corner here, where you stand on a plate and it moves you around, and it's really good for weight loss, apparently. what is it? It's called, what's it called? I thought it was called. Sorry?
Fabulous.
Flablous. 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 Alright. You stand on this plate that moves around. Of course, it's tensing all your muscles. And as your muscles are being tensed, then you're burning up calories and it helps. So you can just imagine what it's like standing on this ship that's been bounced around for days on end. You know, they're not eating properly. Paul gets them to eat at some point. And not only is there this physical exhaustion, but there's this mental exhaustion as well. Sometimes if it's surprising, isn't it? If you're in something which is mentally tiring. Somebody takes an exam, they come out and they're shattered. Well, if you take part, you know, if you just wrote your name there, I don't know anything else, I suppose you'd feel quite laid back. But if you tried really hard for a couple of hours, you must come out and be absolutely exhausted. And think, well, how can you be exhausted? You've just been writing, or you've been worked. You can sit at the desk all day and work, but come out of it absolutely exhausted. You're exhausted because you're mentally exhausted. You've been using your brain, and you're just, all your energy levels have dropped down, and you're really, really tired. And they must have been in that situation. Bear in mind, they're soaked to the skin. They've had to swim ashore, and this is probably late October, maybe November. I know the Mediterranean is warmer, but you know, I don't really want to be swimming in a storm at night in November, even in the Mediterranean. And they're exhausted, they're cold, and they're wet. And even when they get, you know, ashore, there was no guarantee that the islanders were going to receive them. Interesting, the NIV is quite kind to these islanders because it describes them as islanders. But the word is barbaros, meaning barbarian. And for the Greeks, anybody who didn't speak the language was a barbarian, really. And so these were sort of unknown people. They didn't know what language they spoke. They spoke apparently a kind of Phoenician language. You know, a different kind of language, again, connected with Carthage and stuff. And so they didn't speak either Latin or Greek. It wasn't the predominant language, although it was a Roman colony. And so these people are speaking a different language. You know, for all the crew knew they could have just swept over them and killed them all, and yet they didn't. They'd been in great danger, so they're exhausted. And I think, you know, sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes I can feel washed up. Just exhausted. You know, you've expended energy, and you get to the end of it, I just want to lie down. You know, I just want to sit down for a minute and just to unwind. Or sometimes it can be worse than that, just not something for a day. It can be something that has been playing. It can be a mental exhaustion. You know, stress is mentally exhausting. Depression is mentally exhausting. At the end of it, you feel exhausted. And that's the position that these people are in. And, you know, many of us, I think, can sort of relate to that. To know what it is to feel completely exhausted, to be washed up. And I've known what that feels like. Then, you know, what's the answer to that? How do we, well, Paul's answer, what does it mean to wash up? Well, Paul's answer to being washed up was to serve. You know, he's a man of real high standing, Paul. He's a Roman citizen. When he's speaking before the king, and we did that, I think, a fortnight ago, he's speaking before the king, and the king says to him, Paul, your learning has driven you mad. Oh, that was Festus. Your great learning has driven you mad. He was acknowledged as being a great academic, a very learned man. He had learned from the best. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel. He had a great education. Not only did he have a great education, not only was he respected as a Jew, but in a world of the Roman Empire, he was unusual in that he was not just an ordinary person, but he was a Roman citizen, which meant that he had particular rights. We've read earlier in this account when he's arrested that originally they're stretching him out, ready to start flogging him, and he says, "This is how you treat a Roman citizen?" And immediately again's reversed because we can't treat Roman citizens like that. He was a man of standing. When he's on the ship, the centurion is speaking to Paul. Paul is advising a centurion, so he's a man of great standing. And as far as the church is concerned, this guy is a giant. I mean, he still is today, isn't he? You know, if you had to list the top Christians who have ever been in the church, the worldwide church, well, you know, if Paul isn't the top guy, well, he's pretty close, isn't he? You know, he's one of the most important figures in Christianity. In the growth of the church, he wrote whole sections of the New Testament. He formulated our doctrine. He's an incredibly important man. God used him for an amazing things. He was the first person to bring the gospel of Jesus to Europe. Just, you know, a giant in the church. And you have to ask, well, couldn't someone else have collected the firewood? You know, what are you doing, Paul? Get someone else. Get one of the minions to collect the firewood. But actually it's Paul who's going around collecting firewood and feeding this fire. And I think that tells us something about Paul, and it tells us something about the Christian faith, I think, because our faith is about service, isn't it? We're called to serve. I think when the first Labour government came into power, I can't think of the guy who's leading the Labour Party, but he got all the MPs together and he said, "We're the masters now." You know, the people who've been downtrodden for years are now we're in charge. Look out. But in 1997, Labour were re-elected, weren't they? And the leader was Tony Blair. And now here's a man, you know, who could recognise a soundbite when he saw one, and when he heard one rather. And I mean, the Good Friday Agreement. He came out and said, "This is not a time for sound bites, but we can all feel the hand of history on our shoulders." You know, he's a guy who could just speak sound bites. But one of the things he said when he got all the MPs together in the first Labour government for years, and he said, "We are the servants now." And I don't know whether he said that for effect, and I mean, it's interesting, you know, if ever you do a talk, if you put a picture of Tony Blair, people start jeering at you, you know. But he was right in that. You see, because they should be servants, shouldn't they? MPs, you know. They're really supposed to be public servants. They're not there to scam their expenses, are they? They're there, supposedly, to serve the country, to serve the population, the citizens. And as Christians, we are called to serve. Paul is seeking to emulate Christ. Jesus said, "The rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, but not among you. Whoever would be first, let him be last. Whoever would be great, let him serve." Jesus said that. This is the Jesus who got down on his hands and knees and washed the feet of the disciples. You know, this is not just dust. This is disciples walking around Jerusalem, which is, the population has been swelled by over 1 million people probably, and there are all kinds of animals for sacrifices and open sewers, and they're walking through this, and they come to this last meal that they're going to share with Jesus, and their feet are probably absolutely rank and filthy, and it's Jesus who gets down on his hands and knees and washes them. The Son of God. And Paul, when he's writing to the Philippians, he writes that great exposition of who Jesus is, but he writes it, in chapter 2 of Philippians, he writes it in the context of your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, thought not equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. You see, this Jesus who made himself nothing, we love to think about that Jesus made himself nothing, that he became a servant, he became a human being, that he was humble unto death, even death on a cross. It's so humbling to think that Jesus did that, but Paul's point is, you've got to have the same attitude.